New Republic via GCR, 235 points of fact as of June 3, 2016. By Judy Byington. June 3, 2016. Website: childabuserecovery.com. Produced by Higher Self.
Nearly 450 years ago, the Anglo-Saxon world banking system began with creation of the Vatican Historical Asset Trust accounts, today known as the Global Collateral Accounts. These funds of sovereign countries were mainly backed by gold reserves of the ancient Chinese royal dragon families. Certain sovereign families of Asia and Europe had pooled their assets into a series of very complex and secretive, off-ledger, private banking trust accounts. The monies were intended for humanitarian projects to help the world for the better, though had been fraudulently abused by a corrupt global banking system since at least the late 1600s. In 1694, this global monetary system, overseen by a secretive cabal, was being run out of a central bank in England controlled by the Rothschilds family. Baron Nathan Mayer Rothschild once declared, "I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." By the mid to late 1700s of Eastern Europe, these dark forces had gained complete control of the planet's wealth by secretively taking over world assists through an invisible web of usury and fiat finance. The cabal's influence upon greedy global leaders led to domination over the world's military, diplomacy, education, science and media systems. In 1871, the cabal created the Corporation of the U.S. to work under orders of the World Monetary Organizations, International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, Bank of International Settlements, North American Union, Council on Foreign Relations, Committee of 300 and the Trilateral Commission. They discarded the U.S. Constitution, manipulated funds of central banks across the globe, and eventually formed the U.S. Federal Reserve to continue their plunder of global assets. The privately owned U.S. Incorporated, U.S. Federal Reserve and U.S. Treasury were designed to conform to dictates of those loyal to Masonic orders such as Skull and Bones, institutions like London's Crown Temple and the Vatican, plus private families of European royalty, the Bilderbergs, George Soros, Rothschilds, Carnegies, and Rockefellers. Among their ranks were powerful church, government, political, education and business people, bankers, European royals, Vatican hierarchy, and former Nazi mind control experts brought into the U.S., Canada and Australia after World War II upon formation of the CIA. In a greedy quest for power, these global elites were said to attend child exploitation get-togethers in order to blackmail politically powerful participants, gain power and privilege, and thus influence world events. These same global elites were known to work with the Hazarian or Ndrangheta mafias to run criminal enterprises extensively involved in drug and gun running, plus the kidnapping of vulnerable children and youth. Those who kept atrocities on innocent children under wraps enjoyed free manipulation of world monetary funds under protection of the mafia criminal syndicates, with their dirty money freely laundered through the Vatican Bank. Since 2012, eyewitnesses to this rape, torture, murder, kidnapping and exploitation of children by global elite bankers have testified before the International Common Law Court of Justice in Brussels. Apparently, a criminal syndicate based in Italy regularly supplied indigent children for use in satanically oriented sex abuse and child sacrifice ceremonies. The kidnapping rings worked through the Vatican Office of Catholic Charities, Jesuit Superior General or U.S., Netherlands and European government and church-owned foster, daycare, and youth detention centers. One of the most horrific examples was the Canadian child genocide. See the International Tribunal into Crimes of Church and State head Kevin Annette's award-winning documentary film, Unrepentant. For 3 years, survivor witnesses who went before the 6 international judges claimed that well-known world leaders regularly sexually abused and killed children in satanic ceremonies. Their unholy rites were directed by what was known as the Satanic Ninth Circle child sacrifice cult. The Ninth Circle was globally based, centuries old, and closely tied to the CIA, Vatican, Nazi Germany, European royalty, prominent world leaders and bankers of the global monetary system. Apparently, the rituals layered in pedophilia and child sacrifice were supported by the International Monetary Fund, with monies funneled out of the CIA and further filtered through the Vatican Bank. Obama U.S. State Department. Pedophilia cover-up. HBO's Bill Maher and DynCorp pedophile cover-up, Council on Foreign Relations tied to both HBO and DynCorp. The most influential of their cabal organizations was the privately owned U.S. Federal Reserve. The Fed had functioned as the primary creator of world reserve currency since the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference at the end of World War II. The practice of charging U.S. citizens interest for use of their own money depleted U.S. gold reserves to where none existed in Fort Knox and eventually created the petrodollar. Allowing easy credit soon led to a global economy that functioned on currency that was backed by nothing. The 1999 NISRA Act, the National Economic Stabilization and Recovery Act, also known as the National Economic Security and Reformation Act, was formed to correct the situation. NISRA came about from a 1993 ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court after 30 years of lawsuits by the Farmers Union. In that successful suit, the U.S. banking system and U.S. government were found to be in collusion to defraud U.S. citizens. Yet to this day, NISRA lay hidden in congressional archives collecting dust. NISRA. By the year 2000, and to avoid a global monetary crisis, an urgent need for a reset of world currencies became apparent. Beginning in 2007 and running through 2015, all countries of the globe except for the US, had joined asset-backed currency of a newly formed BRICS alliance. BRICS was an acronym representing the nations of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. In retaliation to the world's main reserve currency of the fiat US dollar, the BRICS system supported a country's currency through its natural resources, oil, gold, silver, copper, and other precious metals. This led to the global currency reset of May 2016, a complicated process concerning a revaluation of world currencies that included removal of the Federal Reserve and certain global elites, along with their Hazarian mafia, from control of the global monetary system. The reset would restore a new U.S. republic that functioned under NISRA law and within the original constitution. U.S. citizens would finally be given their own gold-backed currency, along with much-needed changes in the U.S. tax and banking systems. On April 26, 2016, the global currency reset began playing out when China formally launched a return to the gold standard through the BRICS system. Completion of the GCR rollout across the world was scheduled to occur the latter part of May of 2016. By this same time, the cabal had bankrupted themselves, plus their privately owned U.S. Federal Reserve dollar was no longer being accepted for world trade. The history of that process included formation of the new U.S. Republic, integration of the Federal Reserve into the U.S. Treasury, and changes in the U.S. tax system. Initially, there would be a revalue of 20 different currencies, including the Iraqi dinar, Vietnamese dong, Zimbabwe zim, Indian rupiah, and Iranian rial. Revaluation of other world currencies was expected to quickly follow. Higher exchange rates were made available during the first 6 days of initial exchanges, especially if a good percentage of monies were dedicated to humanitarian projects. These projects were said funded in part by gold of the Chinese royal dragon families and by $800 trillion in U.S. taxpayer monies illegally taken by the Federal Reserve during the Bush administration, then confiscated during a 1992 Federal Reserve audit. Another source of funds was $3.8 trillion gained through a negotiated agreement with Soviet Secretary General Mikhail Gorbachev during the fall of the Soviet Union. The $3.8 trillion had also been illegally held by the Federal Reserve. It was also found through an intensive investigation that Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court John Roberts and President Bush Sr. had stolen $9.1 trillion of USA taxpayers' funds from the U.S. Treasury. The mastermind behind this heist by Roberts and Bush was said to be Henry Kissinger. By midday on Friday, March 21, 2008, John Roberts' control of the USA Treasury had been terminated by a majority vote of the other USA Supreme Court justices. 3 of the assistant justices were discovered to have been conspiring with Bush and Roberts in administering the $9.1 trillion Treasury theft. On Monday, March 31, 2008, Federal Prosecutor of the United States Department of Justice Office of Special Counsel Patrick Fitzgerald had a team of 177 attorneys working uninterrupted all night at the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Supreme Court. The stolen or misapplied funds vastly exceeded America's gross annual budget. During his investigations into the U.S. government wire frauds at the Treasury, Fitzgerald stumbled across an altogether larger legal fraud. Washington, D.C. itself had no right in constitutional law to run America. Washington, D.C. was a system of corporate scams constructed to milk the American people without their knowing. The United States was not even the United States of America. The data retrieved spelled slow death for the Washington, D.C. ruling class, especially when the U.S. Congress's long-lost NISRA legislation was ruled valid by the U.S. Supreme Court. NISRA. Repeated attempts to pay off the U.S. national debt using these $800 trillion, $3.8 trillion, and $9.1 trillion of taxpayer monies illegally held by the Federal Reserve had been continually thwarted by the cabal. At present, the funds were in European bank accounts awaiting the global currency reset. See this soon-to-be-released trailer of a documentary about corruption in the Federal Reserve, Eagle 1 to Wanta. There is also a feature documentary film about the U.S. monetary system and its relationship to the cabal, CIA, 9/11, which happened as an initial global currency reset was to take place, Presidents Johnson and Bush's and the assassination of President Kennedy. Right before Kennedy was murdered, he had signed documents which would have closed the Federal Reserve. History. 1. The privately owned U.S. Federal Reserve System started around 450 years ago with creation of a Vatican trust account attached to the generational wealth of several nations. This world financial system was set up by and mainly funded through gold of the ancient Chinese royal dragon families of Asia. 2. The ancient Chinese Royal Dragon Society was an organization of old families within China and Taiwan who operated above the political divide of the two independent Chinese governments. The Chinese held that old family ties and functions superseded political arrangements and were inconsequential over the passage of time. 3. Dragon families were said to abstain from any public view and knowledge, but acted for the benefit of the world in coordination with higher levels of the global financial organizations, Committee of 300 and in particular, the private Federal Reserve System. 4. Dragon families had accumulated great wealth, with trillions in interest payments still owing, in the form of a variety of notes, bonds, and certificates that were an obligation of the Federal Reserve System. These bonds had values ranging in the many thousand of trillions of US dollars. 5. In the last decade, the Dragon Family Organization attempted to contribute significant billions of US dollars for the purpose of aiding numerous global humanitarian purposes, such as relief during disasters to countries throughout the world, including Hurricane Katrina in the United States, earthquakes in Haiti, China, and Indonesia, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, rebuilding the Republic of Georgia's infrastructure, water, and energy supply for the Cayman Islands, Bangladesh and more. 6. In the late 1700s, a group in Eastern Europe known as the Cabal began taking control of the global monetary system using fiat or paper currency that was not asset-backed. To counter this movement, some sovereign families of Asia and Europe, dominated by the Chinese royal dragon families, pooled their gold assets into secretive off-ledger private banking trusts now known as the Global Collateral Accounts, or Global Debt Facility. 7. On the darker side, Switzerland, the home and legal origin of United Nations charters, housed cabal organizations of the International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization and Bank of International Settlements. The Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland controlled all central banks of what was known as the G7 nations. He who controls the gold, rules the world. 8. In the U.S., the cabal-operated monetary system went back to founding of the United States of American Corporation in 1871, reorganization in 1907, Jekyll Island in 1910 and forming of the privately owned Federal Reserve in 1913. They discarded the U.S. Constitution, manipulated funds of central banks across the globe, and used the U.S. Federal Reserve to plunder global assets rather than utilizing the monies for their original humanitarian purpose, thereby enriching their own and fellow global elites' pockets. 9. Since the U.S. monetary system began, it has been subject to the privately owned U.S. Incorporated and U.S. Federal Reserve, plus other cabal organizations including the Hazarian Mafia. Cabal monies were commonly laundered through the Vatican Bank. 10. The U.S. Federal Reserve functioned under orders of the International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, Bank of International Settlements, North American Union, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, and Committee of 300. 11. This corrupt system was run by political elite secret society members whose allegiance was to Masonry, including those initiated into Skull and Bones, or were associated with the sovereign city of London's Crown Temple, Vatican hierarchy, or in private families such as European royalty, the Bilderbergs, George Soros, Rothschilds, Carnegies and Rockefellers. 12. The private U.S. Federal Reserve System, which issued fiat U.S. Federal Reserve notes, was financially owned and controlled by the Crown Temple Bar in the independent and sovereign city of London. 13. Bar stands for British Accredited Regency. The City of London Crown Temple Bar also controlled the U.S. judiciary system. 14. In the War of 1812, British soldiers had destroyed copies of the Titles of Nobility Amendment, because it prevented anyone who had ties to the Crown of England from holding public office. U.S. attorneys gave oath to the Crown Temple Bar of England in order to become licensed under practices of the U.S. Bar Association. 15. The U.S. Bar Association was owned by the Northern Trust Company, which eventually also owned as a holding company the U.S. taxpayer system of the Internal Revenue Service. For all intents and purposes, the IRS and U.S. Bar Association functioned as the same entity under the control of the Vatican and Crown of England. 16. In the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, both sides were financed by the Crown Temple in London, and all subsequent legal and financial settlements were controlled by the Crown Temple for the Vatican. 17. Because of this mutual agreement and ties between the Vatican, London Crown Temple, U.S. Bar Association and the IRS, it became important to have Roman Catholics placed in ruling positions in the Washington, D.C. Corporation and at the Supreme Court. After all, American bar attorneys worked for the British Accredited Registry or British Accreditation Registry, and legally, American taxes, treasury and resources were chattels of old Europe. 18. This mess, which continued today, came about in 1871 when a privately owned United States of American corporation was secretly and covertly founded for the purpose of controlling the U.S. monetary system. The corporation was simply a privately owned maritime corporation out of Puerto Rico using funding of the Royal Dragon families. 19. In 1910, at Jekyll Island, Georgia, the U.S. corporation fraudulently put together this monetary system as an omnipotent fiat dollar-making machine. Among the founders were J.P. Morgan and National City Bank President Frank A. Vanderlip. Shunning use of their last names, the group met at a privately owned railway car in New Jersey. 20. By 1913, this secretive organization had become the privately owned and Rothschild-dominated Federal Reserve System that served as the U.S. Central Bank. 21. The U.S. Congress was said to be bought off as they secretly passed the illegal and unconstitutional Federal Reserve Act of 1913. A corrupt President Wilson signed it into law. 22. In an act of treason, the U.S. Congress allowed the privately owned Federal Reserve to print the emerging nation's physical money for the U.S. Treasury. 23. Under the 1913 Federal Reserve Act and the privately owned Fed, the almighty USD quickly spread as a de facto global reserve currency, replacing the British pound sterling. 24. The Fed alone was allowed to have full global monetary authority over the rest of the world and print as many US dollars as they deemed necessary without any international oversight, except to those private families owning the central banking system. 25. The Federal Reserve Bank was not connected to the US government, but composed of a group of privately owned central banks with a main interest of serving the cabal. The central banks acted on behalf of sovereign countries to buy bonds backed by the Chinese Royal Dragon family historical asset trust accounts. 26. The Federal Reserve was also a franchise of the Hazarian banking mafia, known as the Rothschild World Money Changers. They were notorious for creating money from nothing and lending it to 98% of the world's nations in order to receive pernicious usury in exchange. 27. The Rothschild Hazarian Mafia banksters not only created about 98% of the world money from thin air, they charged interest to those who used their own money. Usury alone added 40% to the cost of all goods and services in the global community. This was insane for any nation's people to pay a foreign-based private bank of Luciferian child-murdering pedophile Hazarian mafia parasites to use what should have been their own money in the first place. 28. For years this cabal has fought implementation of the global currency reset since it took away a great deal of their power, ongoing monetary gain, and was designed to close their privately owned Federal Reserve System by which they controlled the world. 29. The United States was the only country on the planet that did not have its own national currency. One of the purposes of the global currency reset was for the U.S. to secure and use their own asset-backed currency. 30. For several years U.S. Federal Reserve notes backed by gold borrowed from the Royal Dragon families, had been used for government and trade purposes. This monetary system functioned under the non-U.S. government-owned North American Union. 31. The Federal Reserve notes that were used by the common U.S. citizens had no backing at all and were referred to as fiat currency. Fiat currency was any non-asset-backed money declared by the government to be legal tender. 32. Thus, since inception of the nation, U.S. citizens had been forced to buy their Federal Reserve note currency, along with paying interest on it, from the privately owned Federal Reserve. 33. The Federal Reserve note had interest attached to it which helped create our nation's well over $17 trillion national debt. Some would say that the U.S. was well over $100 trillion in debt. 34. Greed ruled the privately owned U.S. central banking system. The funds from the Chinese Dragon families were originally designed for humanitarian purposes, though U.S. citizens were forced to pay interest on their own money in order to use it, with earnings fed into the corrupt cabal banking system. 35. For these many years the U.S. government has borrowed a huge amount of collateral assets in gold and silver from the dragon families. Therefore the U.S. government was able to issue huge amounts of USD as currencies via the Federal Reserve. 36. The likes of William Jennings suggested a new central bank under the U.S. Republic, but like many such proposals to Congress, Jennings' plan never saw the light of day. 37. By November 16, 1914, the time the First World War began, privately owned central banks under this corrupt system had been opened in 12 U.S. cities. The U.S. indirectly financed the war by helping in the flow of trade goods to Europe, and more so when they declared war on Germany in 1917. 38. By the 1920s, as the world was regaining to normalcy, it was recognized that gold was no longer a central factor in credit control. History of the Federal Reserve System. 39. In March of 1933, President Roosevelt changed Constitution wording away from constitutional law and declared the bankruptcy of the United States. 40. The banks took over our gold and silver money that was backed by a gold standard. The result was more fiat money. Before 1933, paper money was backed by gold. The Federal Reserve notes were money substitutes backed only by a false belief. 41. In 1934, the U.S. Internal Revenue Service came on shore and was immediately purchased by an attorney firm which incorporated it as the Delaware Corporation. 42. The corrupt financial system came to a head at the end of World War II. A mind control program called MK-Ultra was begun upon import of Nazi-trained mind control experts into the US, Canada and Australia. The Nazis helped design philosophy behind the creation of the CIA in 1954. The mind control program, funded by US tax dollars for the purpose of developing super spies and assassins, was tightly tied into the world monetary system. 43. George H. W. Bush was influential in the forming of the CIA and their mind control program MK-Ultra. The November 13, 2010 New York Times reported that Dr. Joseph Mengele was among the Nazis given a safe haven in the U.S. through the CIA-sponsored Project Paperclip, a pre-runner to MK-Ultra. 44. MK-Ultra was heavily involved in human experiments to torture children into multiple personalities through satanic ceremonies of pedophilia and child sacrifices. Global elites, including those in the banking system, were known to regularly hold the satanic child exploitation ceremonies for the purpose of gaining power and privilege. 45. A Canadian mind control victim, now in her mid-60s, gave heart-wrenching details about child genocide during 2012 hearings at the International Common Law Court of Justice in Brussels. She discussed her eyewitness to murders of 7 other children during her 2-year childhood stint at Canadian Air Force Base known as Lincoln Park in Calgary, Alberta. She was a victim of a CIA-funded mind control program to develop super spies. 46. The Brussels ICLJ court heard this and testimonies of 18 other witnesses to illegal activities of the Ninth Circle satanic child sacrifice cult. Children in the CIA mind control program claim to be victimized by a former Nazi SS doctor referred to as Dr. Green. According to the survivor, the Nazi mind control expert and 3 Ninth Circle satanic child sacrifice cult members were working undercover as Canadian military personnel. 47. These human experiments on children were run at the base between 1956 and 1958. On her website, the witness gave tribute to children, like her, who were born into and raised in the CIA mind control program MK-Ultra. Children ages 2 to 10 were put to death, she said, due to the severity of injuries sustained during the course of human medical experiments. 48. In both Canada and the US, several survivors of the CIA mind control program have identified Nazi mind control expert Joseph Mengele as their torturer. He was known by them as a Dr. Green or Green Bomb. 49. Christine Nicola testified about a Dr. Green in 1995 during congressional hearings on human radiation experiments. The mind control survivor said that beginning at the tender age of 4 she was terrorized by CIA operatives under the direction of Dr. Green. They were training her to be a spy and assassin by subjecting the child to radiation, drugs, electroshock, sexual abuse, and mind control experiments. Dr. Green was able to split her young mind into multiple personalities. 50. Dr. Green evidently tortured another witness of the 1995 hearings. Claudia Mullen stated that she discovered documents where the U.S. government gave Dr. Green $50 million to run the program with the CIA Science Division, CIA Office of Research and Development. Mullen said that from age 7 and near Dr. Green's office she was given electroshock, radiation, drugs, isolated in a tub of water, sexually abused, endured sleep deprivation, burns, and all kinds of emotional and physical abuse. She claimed these atrocities were also performed on countless other children. 51. Jenny Hill of Garden Grove, California also claimed to be a victim of Dr. Green's CIA mind control practices. The CIA claimed they closed MK-Ultra in 1964, yet Hill's torture programming by Dr. Green began a year later in 1965. According to her biography, 22 Faces, Hill was abused by Dr. Green and others in a satanic child sacrifice rite that took place on June 21, 1965 summer solstice. In this video, Hill discussed her witness of another 6-year-old child's murder. The severe abuse caused a disintegration of her personality. 52. In Australia, Fiona Barnett also claimed to be a victim of Nazi mind control programming that included human hunting parties where children were raped, hunted down and killed. 53. The cabal's satanic practices and evil purposes under protection of the CIA and Mafia lead to the acceptance and availability of easy credit by the privately owned central banks and Federal Reserve. 54. The immoral practices soon created a fiat US dollar that since the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference at the end of World War II, had functioned as the primary world reserve currency. This resulted in the global economy to function on currency backed by nothing. 55. It was not supposed to be that way. At the end of World War II, with Communist and Kuomintang factions at war in China, the international community and the Chinese assented to their gold being placed under the covert control of Indonesian President Sukarno. As per arrangements agreed in the 1921 Pact of Nations made in London, much of this gold was delivered and hidden in Indonesia and the Philippines in secret bunkers constructed by the Japanese between 1924 and 1945. 56. In June of 1944, a private global monetary control framework was introduced to the world during the Bretton Woods Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Since then, the central banking system has attempted to privatize global wealth, monitoring and restricting the world's money supply, including bonds, banking instruments, stocks, digital, paper and coin currencies. 57. At this same Bretton Woods Conference, NATO introduced a global monetary and military strategy that was agreed to in treaties by 44 allied nations. The allies who won the war, declared that the United States of America was the world's liberator, and therefore should be the world's future military enforcer and top economic power player. 58. Thus, the USA was granted the right to print the de facto global reserve currency, and called it the United States dollar. All other currencies of the world would be held in par comparison to determine their own international value. 59. In 1944, post-World War II, at this Bretton Woods conference, the Chinese elders and cabal agreed to a transition, truce in order to reset the world's financial system, after several gruesome world wars. The elders would place a minority percentage of the global collateral accounts, specifically gold, into central bank vaults worldwide. 60. They physically transferred, said, gold over a 2-year period, which established the current financial system in 1946. A common gold standard against currency was to be spot set daily in the City of London. 61. This benevolent gold was unleased to all good-standing sovereign nations. For a 50-year period, with a 5-year transition period ending in the fall of 2001. 62. The SWIFT system, Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication Banking System, was a private institution based in Belgium composed of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, Wall Street banks and the Bank for International Settlements. The SWIFT system operated in 215 countries and territories. This network was involved in international monetary transfers heavily influenced by the Rothschild family. 63. In 1971, President Nixon allowed the Federal Reserve Bank to print the nation's money without ding previously agreed to gold standard treaties. This act effectively ignored the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement and revalued all U.S.-issued debt, past, present and future, against the per-barrel price of oil, known as the petrodollar. 64. This instigation of the petrodollar into world currency by President Richard Nixon took the U.S. dollar off the gold standard, thus further perverting the value of the now artificial fiat U.S. dollar. 65. Between the late 1980s and 2016, practically every U.S. president has had their hand in the International Monetary Fund. The level of corruption saturated every nook and cranny of the entity that we call USA Incorporated. These same global leaders were named as perpetrators during satanic ritual abuse, by survivors of the child abuse at exclusive gatherings of Masonic global leaders, such as at Bohemian Grove, California. 66. By 1979, the U.S. military had started training to retake the country and eliminate this cabal shadow government that ruled the corrupt world monetary system. 67. In 1991, Roy Schwasinger went before a Senate committee to present evidence of the international bankers and government criminal activity through the Federal Reserve. He informed them how the corporation of the United States was tied to the establishment of a new world order which intended to bring about a fascist one-world government ruled by the international bankers. 68. In 1992, a task force was put together consisting of over 300 retired and 35 active U.S. military officers who strongly supported constitutional law. This task force was responsible for investigating governmental officials, congressional officers, judges, and the Federal Reserve. 69. The task force included Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Jeremy Bourda, General David McLeod, and former Director of Central Intelligence, William Colby. They uncovered the common practice of bribery and extortion committed by both senators and judges. The criminal activity was so rampant that only 2 out of 535 members of Congress were deemed honest. More importantly, in 1992 they ordered and carried out the first ever, and only, audit of the Federal Reserve. 70. The Federal Reserve was accustomed to giving orders to politicians and had no intentions of being audited. However, after they were informed their offices would be raided under military gunpoint if necessary, they complied with the investigation. After reviewing their files, the military officers found $800 trillion sitting in accounts which should have been applied to the national debt. Contrary to federal government propaganda, they also discovered that most nations owed money to the United States instead of the other way around. 71. These hidden trillions were then confiscated and placed into European bank accounts in order to generate the enormous funds needed to pay a successful farmers' claims class action lawsuit that helped to instigate the 1992 Federal Reserve audit. Later this money would become the basis of the global currency reset prosperity programs. 72. Despite the death blow of losing control of $800 trillion through a 1992 audit of the Federal Reserve, the now president and founder of the CIA mind control program MKUltra, George H.W. Bush, garnered the help of the Illuminati to continue on with their plans of global enslavement. This included using mind control torture methods gained from adult and child victims of Nazi Germany concentration camps. 73. In August 1992, the military officers confronted President Bush and demanded he sign an agreement that he would return the United States to constitutional law. He was ordered to never use the term New World Order again. Bush pretended to cooperate, but secretly planned to bring about the New World Order anyway, using the CIA and their use of mind control to overpower the American public. 74. On December 25, 1992, President George H.W. Bush set out to sign an executive order that would have indefinitely closed all banks, giving Bush an excuse to declare martial law. Under the chaos of martial law, Bush intended to install a new constitution which would have kept everyone currently in office in their same position for 25 years, plus removed all rights to elect new officials. The military intervened and stopped Bush from signing that executive order. 75. In 1993, members of the Supreme Court, certain members of Congress and representatives from the Clinton government met with high-ranking U.S. military officers who were demanding a return to constitutional law, reforms of the banking system and financial redress. Clinton, however, was a proponent of the New World Order and the CIA mind control programs. As a result, nothing of substance was done. See CIA Mind Control salve Kathy O'Brien's books Access Denied and Transformation of America. 76. The 1999 NISRA Act, the National Economic Stabilization and Recovery Act, also known as the National Economic Security and Reformation Act, came about after a 1993 ruling of the U.S. Supreme Court, after 30 years of lawsuits by the Farmers Union. 77. In that successful suit, the U.S. banking system and U.S. government were found to be in collusion to defraud U.S. citizens. 78. Also in that successful suit, it was proven in court that the U.S. Office of the Internal Revenue Service that collected taxes from citizens, had never been ratified by the U.S. Congress. 79. Initially, the Clinton administration attempted to get the World Court to overrule NISRA, though by 1999 the true NISRA law was introduced in Congress. 80. NISRA was the most groundbreaking reformation to sweep the U.S. The 1999 Act did away with the Federal Reserve Bank, IRS, and shadow U.S. government of the cabal, plus implemented the following changes. A. Zeroes out all credit card, mortgage, and other bank debt due to illegal banking and government activities. This is the Federal Reserve's worst nightmare, a jubilee or a forgiveness of debt. B. Abolishes the U.S. income tax. C. Abolishes the IRS. Employees of the IRS will be transferred into the U.S. Treasury National Sales Tax Area. D. Creates a 14% flat rate non-essential new items only sales tax revenue for the government. In other words, food and medicine will not be taxed, nor will used items such as old homes. E. Increases benefits to senior citizens. F. Returns constitutional law to all courts and legal matters. G. Reinstates the original title of nobility amendment. H. Establishes new presidential and congressional elections within 120 days after Nizara's announcement. The interim government will cancel all national emergencies and return us back to constitutional law. I. Monitors elections and prevents illegal election activities of special interest groups. J. Creates a new U.S. Treasury rainbow currency backed by gold, silver, and platinum precious metals, ending the bankruptcy of the United States initiated by Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. K. Forbids the sale of American birth certificate records as chattel property bonds by the U.S. Department of Transportation. L. Initiates a new U.S. Treasury bank system in alignment with constitutional law. M. Eliminates the Federal Reserve System. During the transition period, the Federal Reserve will be allowed to operate side by side of the new U.S. Treasury for 1 year in order to remove all Federal Reserve notes from the money supply. N. Restores financial privacy. O. Retrains all judges and attorneys in constitutional law. P. Ceases all aggressive, U.S. government military actions worldwide. Q. Establishes peace throughout the world. R. Releases enormous sums of money for humanitarian purposes. S. Enables the release of over 6,000 patents of suppressed technologies that are being withheld from the public under the guise of national security, including free energy devices, anti-gravity, and sonic healing machines. 81. Not surprisingly, much disinformation about Nizara could be found on the internet. Wikipedia's article was total disinformation. Dr. Harvey Francis Barnard's Nizara bill was rejected by Congress in the 1990s. Dr. Barnard was a systems philosopher and had tried for years to interest Congress in his monetary reform suggestions. 82. Late one evening on March 9, 2000, a written quorum call was hand-delivered by Delta Force and Navy SEALs to 15 members of the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House who were sponsors and co-sponsors of Nizara. They were immediately escorted by the Delta Force and Navy SEALs to their respective voting chambers where they passed the Nesra Act. 83. These 15 members of Congress were the only people lawfully allowed to hold office in accordance with the original 13th Amendment, which made a lawyer's oath to the British Crown. 84. Finally, in a March 9, 2000 required meeting, Congress passed Nizara. 85. During the November 8, 2000 U.S. election fiasco in Florida of Bush Jr., the state was approached by 4,000 CIA agents of Bush Sr. Officials were told that they must make Bush Jr. president or there would be civil war in the U.S. 86. In October 2000, people in military betrayed their agreement to implement Nizara. President Clinton had no interest in signing Nizara into law. 87. On October 10, 2000, and under orders from U.S. military generals, the elite Naval SEALs and Delta Force stormed the White House. Under gunpoint, they forced then-President Bill Clinton to sign Nizara. During this time, Secret Service and White House security personnel were ordered to stand down, were disarmed, and allowed to witness this event under a gag order. President Clinton also relinquished his bar registry. 88. From its very inception, the promoter of mind control Bush Sr., the corporate government, major bank houses, and the Carlyle Group have opposed Nizara. To maintain secrecy, the case details and the docket number were sealed and revised within the official congressional registry to reflect a commemorative coin. It was again revised even more recently. This is why there was no public congressional records about Nizara and why a search for this law would not yield the correct details until after the reformations were made public. 89. Members of Congress will not reveal NISRA because they have been ordered by the U.S. Supreme Court justices to deny its existence, or face charges of treason punishable by death. Some members of Congress have actually been charged with obstruction over their discussions of NISRA. When Minnesota Senator Paul Wellstone was about to break the gag order, his small passenger plane crashed, killing his wife, daughter, and himself. If fear was not enough to keep Washington in line, money was. Routine bribes were offered to government and military officials by the power elite/secret government. 90. The next step was the difficult task of announcing NISRA to the world. Many powerful groups tried to prevent the implementation of NISRA. The NISRA law required that at least once a year, an effort be made to announce the law to the public. 3 current U.S. Supreme Court judges have used their authority on the committee in charge of NISRA's announcement to secretly sabotage efforts to reveal NISRA. 91. On September 9, 2001, 18 months after NISRA became law, the Supreme Court justices ordered the 107th Congress to pass a resolution approving NISRA. That same day Congress passed NISRA. 92. The next day on September 10, 2001, George Bush Sr. moved into the White House to steer his son on how to block the announcement of NISRA. 93. Upon forming the CIA after World War II, Bush Sr. helped to import those Nazi mind control specialists into the US, Canada and Australia. Bush Sr.'s father had ties to Nazi Germany. Bush Sr. helped run the mind control, torture, rape and murder of children by the CIA. Bush Sr. also managed the CIA in Dallas during the Kennedy assassination. It was well known that the CIA controlled the media. 94. The day after Bush Sr. moved into the White House on September 11, 2001, at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Alan Greenspan was scheduled to announce the new U.S. Treasury bank system, debt forgiveness for all U.S. citizens, and abolishment of the IRS as the first part of the public announcements of NISRA. 95. It was speculated that on September 11, 2001 at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the cabal, working with the CIA, did the unthinkable in New York City. 2 nuclear devices were imploded beneath the Twin Towers. 96. It was alleged that just before the announcement at 9 a.m. on September 11, 2001, Bush Sr. ordered the demolition of the World Trade Center's Twin Towers to stop the international banking computers on floors 1 and 2 in the North Tower from initiating the new U.S. Treasury bank system. Explosives in the World Trade Center were said to be planted by operatives and detonated remotely in Building 7, which it is alleged, was demolished later that day in order to cover up their crime. 97. It was also said that on September 11, 2001, remote pilot technology was used in a flyover event to deliver a payload of explosives into the Pentagon at the exact location of a group of military personnel known as the White Knights. Back in 1871, upon creation of the United States of America Incorporated and as a contingency plan, the military had formed an interim government headed by these White Knight military leaders. On September 11, 2001, the White Knights were coordinating activities supporting NISRA's implementation nationwide from their new Naval Command Center at the Pentagon, which was destroyed during the events of 9/11. 98. With the announcement of NISRA stopped dead in its tracks, George Bush Sr. was said to have decapitated any hopes of returning the government back to the people. 99. Between the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Bush family crime syndicate was believed to have stolen $800 trillion in taxpayer monies through use of the Federal Reserve, plus expanded their operations during the past half-decade. 100. The $800 trillion was recovered during a 1992 Federal Reserve audit. More illegally taken taxpayer funds were recovered around 2006. 101. The funds were stored in European accounts awaiting the global currency reset, where they were targeted for use in humanitarian projects. 102. The illegally taken funds formed the basis for some of the criminal charges to be levied against this Broadbush criminal syndicate. An organization called the New Republic was holding off on these arrests until a series of charges were authenticated and could be acted upon. 103. A major film documentary, Eagle One to Wanta, covered how President Reagan's secret agent ambassador, Lee Emil Wanta, amassed $3.8 trillion through a negotiated agreement with Soviet Secretary General Mikhail Gorbachev during the fall of the Soviet Union. The $3.8 trillion was designed to go back to the American people, but was stolen by the Federal Reserve System. Wanta has pledged to eliminate our national debt overnight, after a 2006 U.S. District Court mandate was honored that would return the money. The documentary was scheduled to be released upon announcement of the new U.S. Republic. 104. By 2007, 2 world wars and several conflicts had been funded by the Federal Reserve in a failed, yet direct response, to give the Royal Dragon families back their collateralizing assets to a rapidly defaulting central banking system. 105. On Friday, January 18, 2008, colleagues heard the 17th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Glover Roberts, a prominent American Roman Catholic, say that the NISA global prosperity packages would never be delivered. 106. By March 2008, it was decided that Chief Justice John Roberts was holding the global prosperity packages illegally in the vaults of the USA Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. 107. On the evening of March 20, 2008, John Roberts called a meeting at the U.S. Treasury. Supported by senior American Roman Catholic archbishops and cardinals, the Vatican in Rome and the Crown Temple in London, John Roberts and George Bush Jr., were conspiring to prevent delivery of the Wanta Plan funds and the NISA global prosperity packages. 108. John Roberts said to his colleagues, "I run Treasury. I decide what will be done, and what I am doing is none of your business. You don't work for the government and you don't work for the American people. You work for me and you will do what I tell you to do, and what I am doing is none of your business. I am sick and tired of calls from all over the world and my business being reported on the internet by Casper. Anyone caught opening their mouth will immediately be fired." 109. John Roberts' problem was that several of his Washington, D.C. colleagues in both the Supreme Court and the Treasury did not agree that it was right for the Chief Justice to act in open defiance of the American Constitution, the International Court of Justice and the International Monetary Fund. 110. John Roberts and Bush Sr. had stolen $9.1 trillion of USA taxpayers' funds from the Treasury. The mastermind behind this heist was said to be Henry Kissinger. The stolen or misapplied funds vastly exceeded America's gross annual budget. 111. By midday on Friday, March 21, 2008, John Roberts' control of the USA Treasury had been terminated by a majority vote of the other USA Supreme Court justices. 112. 3 of the assistant justices were discovered to have been conspiring with Bush and Roberts in administering the $9.1 trillion Treasury theft. They were Samuel Alito, a Roman Catholic with Italian connections, Antonin Scalia, a Roman Catholic with Sicilian connections, and Clarence Thomas, a Roman Catholic with a developed interest in pornography and a public history of sexual harassment. 113. When Roberts' resignation was demanded, he quickly signed the letter, correctly dating it the March 21, 2008, but deliberately signing it fraudulently by writing his name as Robert rather than Roberts. Centuries ago, others successfully falsified biblical texts with similar measures. 114. On Tuesday, March 25, 2008, it emerged that Sandra Day O'Connor, a recently retired Supreme Court Assistant Justice, was actively involved in attempting to trade the stolen $9.1 trillion for Bush and Roberts. O'Connor was regarded as a farm claims and NISA turncoat who was bribed into conspiratorial obedience by the Bush White House. 115. On the morning of Tuesday, March 25, 2008, Roman Catholic Patrick Fitzgerald, federal prosecutor of the United States Department of Justice Office of Special Counsel, returned to the U.S. Treasury to continue his investigation of the stolen monies. A few hours later he was instructed by Chief Justice Roberts to stop his work and leave. 116. By the beginning of April 2008, agents acting for President George Bush Jr. and the Vatican, had a contract out for Patrick Fitzgerald's assassination, and had told him so. Fitzgerald and his co-workers were closely protected, with security provided by Interpol and a Chinese secret society, of which Benjamin Fulford had spoken in 2007. 117. The Chinese enforcers also had people in place within the inner circles of George Bush Jr., George Bush Sr., Dick Cheney, Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, as well as in the special hospitals these people would be taken to in the event of an accident. If the Chinese bullet didn't work, the Chinese syringe certainly would. 118. On Monday, March 31, 2008, Fitzgerald had a team of 177 attorneys working uninterrupted all night at the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Supreme Court. The data retrieved spelled slow death for the Washington, D.C. ruling class. 119. During his investigations into the U.S. government wire frauds at the Treasury, Fitzgerald stumbled across an altogether larger legal fraud. Washington, D.C. itself had no right in constitutional law to run America. Washington, D.C. was a system of corporate scams constructed to milk the American people without their knowing. 120. Fitzgerald also uncovered that the United States was not the United States of America. There were two completely different legal entities operating. There was an illegal president of the U.S. in post, but no legally constituted president of the USA. The U.S., Washington, D.C., was not about the government of the people, by the people, for the people. The U.S. was about the control of the people by the corporations for the Crown Temple in London. 121. All this might have stayed invisible but for NISA and the American financial depression of 2007 to 2008. The combination of these two things engendered irresistible pressures which allowed Special Prosecutor Patrick Fitzgerald to uncover the truth about the U.S. monetary system being run by the cabal. 122. By the time of Fitzgerald's investigation, America's money was gone. There was nothing to replace it with except the NISA World Prosperity Funds. The politicos were desperate. They didn't want NISA. NISA would re-establish constitutional law and they would be forced out of office to face public treason charges. They were terminally desperate. In their desperation, they made mistakes via attempted illegal wire transfers and offshore stealth trades. Their flailing about caused the whole corporate legal fiction to unwind visibly. 123. Historical details described here came to the attention of Patrick Fitzgerald. In April 2008, the Bush-Cheney-Clinton junta was in a fight for its political, legal, and financial life, but still controlled the mainstream corporate media. Thus, the general population was unaware of anything but a politically understated financial crisis, a collapsing dollar, a rising gold price, and a few million foreclosures on domestic properties. 124. Also by 2008, another proponent of the New World Order, the Obama administration, was in charge. Obama refused to work under a budget while ballooning the national debt with a stimulus package that didn't stimulate the economy, but more than tripled the national debt. 125. The US fast began losing their influence as the main world reserve currency, due to its uncontrollable monetary policies, ever-growing debt, and use of fiat currency. 126. These discrepancies built to a head when the Dragons demanded payment for derivatives debts on Lehman Brothers. The Royal Dragon families were very concerned that the US could not even pay the interest on its debt to them. 127. The Dragon families called in their loan on Lehman Brothers, thus causing the 2008 mortgage crisis. 128. When Lehman could not pay off the debt call, the US government declared a global financial emergency, borrowing $700 billion from its citizens in order to maintain repayment schedules negotiated by the Federal Reserve Bank to the Chinese Royal Dragon families. 129. By now nations of the global monetary system had alarming concern about the US national debt and US currency, which had no backing, yet was being used as the main world reserve currency. In 2009 the Royal Dragon families stepped in to form BRICS, an organization of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. 130. A 2011 treaty white paper informed different global finance ministers of the economical conditions of the world. As a result, Ireland challenged the world monetary system, saying, "If you can prove that you loaned us any money, we will gladly pay you. But if you can't, basically go pound sand." And they held to it. They had that same thing going on with Greece. It was believed that if the right one had gotten elected in Greece, they would have done the same thing as they did to Ireland. 131. In the fourth quarter of 2012, as the settler on an Econo Trust lien against the Federal Reserve Bank, and to prevent them from rechartering, the Federal Reserve was melded into the new United States Treasury, now located in Reno, Nevada, under what was eventually called the New Republic, formally formed in 2015. 132. By 2015 all the nations of the world except for the US and Japan, had joined BRICS. Japan joined in the fall of 2015, leaving the US as the lone holdout. 133. BRICS economic resources united together to replace the US as the world's leading economic power, but BRICS had a problem. The fiat US dollar was the global reserve currency by which all other currencies are valued as equal. 134. To solve their problem, BRICS re-evaluated the currencies of the world which had joined the BRICS system. They backed all those world currencies with natural resources of the countries and gold reserves of the Dragon families, so as to conform to the IMF's Basel III regulations. 135. By February 2015, the new U.S. Republic had been formed by concerned Congresspeople. The Royal Dragon families had demanded formation of this new republic as a necessary step before they would back U.S. currency with their gold in the BRICS system. 136. By this time the United States of America Incorporated Corporation was defunct, bankrupt, and operating as a facade. 137. As of March 1, 2015, the Fed, nor the United States of American Corporation, founded in 1871, had liquidity left to satisfy its debt repayments. 138. The Obama administration had repeatedly refused to join BRICS, thus creating a dangerous situation of fiat currency whereby the US, and even all world economies, could easily collapse. 139. The new republic went into formal operation on March 1, 2015. It was stationed in West Virginia and protected by the U.S. Army. 140. In 2015, Marine Corps, General Joseph Dunford, was selected to be the interim president of the new republic, because he had recently been appointed by Congress to be the Joint Chief of Staff at the Pentagon. 141. Also in 2015, when Paul Ryan replaced John Boehner as Senate Majority Leader and Speaker of the House, he did so knowing he might eventually replace Dunford as the interim president of the new republic. As it turned out, Ryan served in the position for a few months while Dunford served as Republic vice president, but Ryan eventually declined the new republic president's job. 142. Under the new republic, the U.S. government was turned over on an interim basis to military leaders referred to as the White Knights. As the only legally operating entity left of the republic, the White Knights worked within the U.S. Pentagon to run the country's affairs. This transition had quietly rolled out going back to fourth quarter 2012. 143. In February 2015, the new U.S. Republic incorporated the 2015 Jade Helm military exercises as part of their movement to take back the original U.S. Constitution. 144. The new republic had to construct a national currency, but they didn't have the gold by which they could comply with the IMF's Basel III. In April 2015, the Chinese elders leased $100 billion in gold to the new republic. 145. U.S. Treasury Reserve notes were created by the new republic for use at the government level, but were not designed to be used on the street. Since 2015, they have been trading the new Treasury Reserve notes internationally, in Europe and in the Japanese market. 146. For a monetary system that could be used by the general U.S. public, the new republic created what's known as United States notes. The only difference between the new U.S. notes currency and the Federal Reserve notes was that the new currency would not be charged interest. 147. The new U.S. note currency was like what President Kennedy had created way back in 1963, when he tried to shut down the Federal Reserve right before he was assassinated. 148. Kennedy's ultimate cost of trying to take down the Federal Reserve using the new U.S. notes was explained in a documentary about to be released as an introduction to the new republic. 149. On April 22, 2015, the Chinese elders began moving the USA into gold-backed currency by making the Treasury Reserve notes live on the back screens. 150. In 2015, the new U.S. Republic, charged with protecting the Royal Dragon family gold that backed the new U.S. currency, located the new U.S. Treasury in Nevada on an Indian reservation, because Indian reservations had free trade zones. 151. One of the major royal funding streams for the U.S. Federal Reserve dollar, which was also the major world's reserve currency, reached its term, with the last of the funding streams cut off at the start of December 2015. 152. Patriots like Winston Stroud helped the Federal Reserve to be absorbed into the U.S. Treasury. 153. The Dragon families excused all U.S. debt when their gold was placed in the new U.S. Treasury in Reno in April 2016. This included excusing debt and derivatives of the Wells Fargo Bank, which is mainly owned by the Dragon families, plus derivatives of certain other banks. There is question about excusing debt and derivatives of the Bank of America since it is heavily used by the cabal. 154. In April 2016, certain patriotic members of Congress formed the new U.S. Republic, U.S. Treasury, and U.S. currency notes. The U.S. notes were backed by the USA's natural resources, plus $100 billion more in gold borrowed from royal dragon families. 155. On January 1, 2016, and as Senate Majority Leader, Paul Ryan replaced Joseph Dunford as interim president of the new republic, with the charge to remain in place as the interim U.S. president until the November 2016 elections. 156. Dunford stepped down to fill the slot as vice president of the new republic. 157. On March 31, 2016, the U.S. finally joined BRICS, opening the door for the new republic to take over and dictate U.S. monetary policy under rules as outlined in the original U.S. Constitution. 158. The new Republic of United States government and Treasury were restored at 6:30 p.m. Wednesday, March 30, 2016, when the Dragon family released funding for the new republic, the real reason for the Chinese visit to the White House that day. 159. The Dragon family's $100 billion in gold that was leased to the new U.S. Treasury was temporarily stored in Texas. 160. On April 1, 2016, an agreement was signed between the old SWIFT system and the new BRICS CIPS system. The Cabal financial system of SWIFT, which had been used in monetary transactions by over 10,000 financial systems worldwide, was taken over by the BRICS CIPS system. 161. On April 8, 2016, Obama, Biden, Chinese elders, and the IMF began a series of emergency meetings in Washington, D.C. that continued through April 14, 2016. 162. In the middle of these meetings on April 10, 2016, over 100 arrests of bankers were made and charged with funding ISIS. 163. On April 11, 2016, Iraq ordered dealers to stop selling dinar. The Iraqi government payouts were now done in bonds. Iraqi bonds stopped trading on the international market. The dinar currency was no longer allowed in or out of Iraq. 164. By April 18, 2016, a disturbing series of events were in motion along the lines of the last financial collapse. U.S. banks were expected to report their worst financial quarter since the start of the Great Recession. The Fed issued a warning to the biggest bank in the country, J.P. Morgan Chase, that they couldn't take another hit without incurring an epic disaster. The letter was addressed to Jamie Dimon, the leader of the bank, who seemed to have become completely immune to prosecution, no matter what he did. It is 19 pages and heavily redacted. The Great Recession blog posted a bullet list. The letter sparked secret meetings among those in power. 165. On April 19, 2016, an announcement was made that the Chinese yuan was now gold-backed and China no longer accepted U.S. Federal Reserve notes in trade. 166. On April 20, 2016, Treasury Secretary Jack Lew announced the new United States notes currency to the world via CNN and Fox News. New United States notes, or gold-backed currency, has been printed with new faces such as Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. 167. On April 21, 2016, at 4 p.m., U.S. markets closed on the U.S. Federal Reserve notes. They were no longer accepted for world trade and only could be used in the U.S. 168. On April 21, 2016, the Chinese yuan became a worldwide gold-backed reserve currency as of 8:30 p.m. Eastern Thursday night. 169. The Zimbabwe dollar price was fixed at a high level as of April 21, 2016. 170. On April 26, 2016, Pentagon Chief of Staff General Joseph Dunford and the New Republic military made their way into the White House via the underground tunnel system. White House on lockdown. New Republic Special Forces alongside General Dunford had entered the White House via JFK's tunnel. Papers of surrender and resignation have been issued. Reported by OperationDisclosure.blogspot.com on April 27, 2016. 171. Between April 26 and April 30, Dunford and his team were involved in negotiations for the surrender of the Cabal and USA Corp. Dunford and the resistance movement knew they could use the threat of exposing the Cabal on a global media live streaming event that was to air on April 30, 2016, for the White House Correspondents' Dinner. 172. Also on April 26, 2016, the global currency reset process began playing out when China formally launched a return to the gold standard. 173. Pentagon sources say that the White House was under lockdown April 26 and 27, as special forces led by General Joseph Dunford entered via tunnel to demand Obama and Biden resignations. The official version was that the White House was under lockdown that day because of a fence jumper. 174. On April 30, 2016, Madame Wu declared the dinar gold-backed and exchanges took place in Atlanta, Georgia. 175. On the evening of April 30, 2016, in Washington, D.C., just before President Obama was scheduled to speak at his White House Correspondents' Dinner, an agreement was reached. The Cabal had functioned on fiat currency through the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve was bankrupt. The Cabal had no choice but to surrender and sign the agreements to begin the global currency reset. If the papers weren't signed, Obama was threatened that as overseeing president, Pentagon head Chief of Staff Joseph Dunford would push Obama aside at the dinner, and publicly announce the new republic in front of all the world's press corps. 176. The BRICS Bankifib, Wells Fargo, and HSBC Bank put a 10 p.m. April 30, 2016, deadline on Citibank to get Basel III compliant or default. A backroom deal was signed at 8:59 and 59 seconds p.m. Citibank defaulted to AIIB, WF, HSBC, and became Basel III compliant, and thus Obama was allowed to speak. Security forces which earlier had been pulled from the Citibank Currency Center redemption locations, returned by midnight. 177. Obama started his talk at the White House Correspondents' Dinner by saying, "It is my honor to be at my last, and perhaps the last, White House Correspondents' Dinner, ha ha ha," and he next says, "The end of the Republic never looked better. I am just counting the days before my death panel. I have only 2 words to close with. Obama. Out." He quickly raises 2 fingers to his lips, Masonic secret degree sign his obligation that enjoins secrecy, and with his other hand picks up the portable mic, raises it over his head, and then intentionally drops the mic out of his hand to the ground. 178. It was reported that after the White House Correspondents' Dinner, Obama did not go back to the White House. For several weeks the Obama family had occupied an apartment inside the Beltway in order to keep up appearances both during his remaining months as president and to act as though the Obama family is staying in D.C. so their 2 girls can finish their education. 179. The plan was to keep everything appearing status quo without bringing attention to the changeover in government, currency, banking, and, ultimately, control of the republic. International rates would change on Forex without fanfare as well, with sovereign rates showing on off-site redemption centers concurrently. 180. By May 2016, the cabal was bankrupt, and their U.S. Federal Reserve dollar was no longer accepted for trade worldwide. Through this bankruptcy, and subsequent backing of the new U.S. Treasury note by gold from the Royal Dragon families, the USA and 100 Indian nations were legally separated from the cabal. Members of the cabal were being arrested under the U.S. Federal Marshal Program. 181. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation told banking giants like J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, New York Mellon Bank and State Street Corp., that their bankruptcy plans were not credible. To put it another way, some of the top Hazarian cabal banks and owners of the Federal Reserve Board were basically being told they were bankrupt. 182. On May 1, 2016, at 8:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the cabal surrendered when Citibank defaulted. 183. On May 1, 2016, the Zimbabwe note was declared gold-backed and was reported to have a value of $11.80 in Europe. 184. On that same Sunday, May 1, 2016, in Iraq, U.S. Secretary Lew made the announcement that the U.S. currency was gold-backed, along with other world currencies. It was now a brand new financial system around the world. On the new digital BRICS system, transactions took place in a matter of seconds, instead of days. 185. On Monday, May 2, 2016, Geneva, Switzerland became a ratifying adherent of the China-sponsored Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, making the Confederation one of the last countries to complete the membership process. 186. By that same Monday at midnight, May 2, 2016, Puerto Rico defaulted on their sovereign loans. Puerto Rico was the headquarters of U.S. Incorporated, the cabal organization fighting the global currency reset. 187. On that Monday, the USA Corporation defaulted also. As a result, all government agencies created by USA Incorporated legally defaulted too, including but not limited to, the Federal Reserve Bank, Internal Revenue Service, Homeland Security, Federal Emergency Management Agency, National Security Agency, Central Intelligence Agency, and National Aeronautics and Space Administration. 188. Legally, the United States corporate government was now under the control of the United Nations Corporation headed by Baron Rothschild. However, the status of the United Nations Corporation itself was doubtful, because they had neither the gold, or the moral standing to maintain the current chaotic and planet-destroying system they oversaw. 189. This Rothschild and Hazarian mafia control had been reduced, in essence, to the bankrupt G7 group of nations. These families that controlled the G7 and UN Corporation were no longer in any position to dictate to the world. Their financial system, the source of their power, was based almost entirely on fraud. The Rothschilds once famously bankrupted the Bank of England by taking their paper money and demanding payment in gold. The White Dragon Society and its allies were now in a position to do the same to these European and U.S. bloodline families. Benjamin Fulford report of May 30, 2016, said that the New York branch of the Hazarian Mafia was now the final obstacle to world peace. 190. As of Monday, May 2, 2016, the USA and 100 Indian nations were legally separate from the cabal. The cabal, along with their Federal Reserve, was bankrupt. The U.S. Federal Reserve note was no longer accepted for trade in and outside of the U.S. Members of the cabal were being arrested under the Federal Marshal Program. 191. On Tuesday morning, May 3, 2016, there was a technical transfer of funds. All sovereign nations had agreed to the new BRICS monetary system, including having asset-backed currencies under Basel III and Basel IV compliance. Ancient historic bonds were reconciled of all countries dating back hundreds of years, including 1776 in the U.S. 192. A hand-chosen white hat military leadership, along with white hat politicians, were positioned and seated in the new republic government to handle the day-to-day operations of the United States. This included military and political oversight over all domestic and international matters concerning the country. 193. The new U.S. Republic put out a gold-backed currency called United States Notes. The Republic's sovereign currency Treasury Reserve notes were already being traded on government world markets. 194. All 208 sovereign nations of the world were diplomatically, militarily, and financially recognizing the Republic of the United States and their USN and TRN monetary value systems. The USA Incorporated was no longer acknowledged on the global stage. 195. Through the USA Incorporated bankruptcy and backing of the new U.S. Treasury note by gold of the Royal Dragon families, the USA and 100 Indian nations were legally separated from the cabal. 196. As of May 2016, the CIA plan was to keep Obama as the face of the regime and use him to transition to a possible Donald Trump presidency. The powers behind the U.S. government throne had changed and Obama was no longer living in the White House. 197. The epic events regarding the changeover of the global monetary system was news throughout Europe and Asia, though no mention was made in the cabal leader George Soros-owned U.S. mainstream media. 198. One very visible sign of the U.S. regime change was the fact that Pentagon sources noted, 1,500 Yale Skull and Bones documents will be released to expose U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, the Bushes, and other cabal members. 199. On Tuesday, May 3, 2016, at 12 midnight to 3 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the digital world monetary system was put into the new BRICS system to officially begin the global currency reset and RV of world currencies. 200. On May 6, 2016, the White House put out a detailed plan for a peaceful transition of power. 201. On May 10, 2016, the following letter was written by Judge Anna Maria Riesinger to United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon and United States Secretary of State John Forbes Kerry. Gentlemen, I am forwarding the content of the following synopsis so that you are fully informed. In the interest of expediting mutual understanding, I have organized the key information. 1. The United States that has been causing all the trouble is only the territories and District of Columbia. Those United States known as the United States of America, minor, have committed fraud against these United States, major, and the entire rest of the world. 2. As a result, the United States major has still not come to the table with regard to the imminent changes in the financial system. 3. The United States major issued new sovereign letters patent in November 2015 and appointed new federal representatives. Mr. Jacob Rothschild representing the UN Corporation and Pope Francis as trustee have both been notified that the United States of America Incorporated has no contract, is acting on a for-hire basis only, and is obligated to honor the terms and conditions of the actual Constitution while doing so. 4. The high contracting powers have similarly been informed that none of the estate trusts named after living Americans and created by the United States Incorporated for its own benefit are contractually valid. These private contracts have been created and secured under conditions of non-disclosure and semantic deceit. 5. The high contracting powers have also been informed that we have acted as the lawful beneficiaries and priority creditors and have authorized the discharge of the national debt owed by the United States Incorporated against our already accrued national credit so as to put an end to all pretense of conflict with or valid commercial claim against the American people and their actual property assets. 6. The position of the United States major is one of guarded optimism. Having clearly defined the problem of fraud and misrepresentation by the United States of America minor, it is now possible to overcome it. That said, we agree that gold has always been the international medium of exchange in modern times, and we understand that other nations may desire or require gold in payment for goods and services. We agree that at least for the time being a precious metals standard may serve to restore a degree of honesty and stability to international markets, and that new and stringent bank regulatory mechanisms are sorely needed to prevent speculation, insurance scams, commodity rigging, and a host of other evils. 7. We draw everyone's attention to the fact that the United States major's lawful money is and has always been the United States silver dollar. We see no reason why our currency would be in any way incompatible with the proposed international return to a precious metals-based system. 8. We welcome the understanding and the assistance of the international community as we put our house in order and point out that as we have authorized our trustees to settle all the debts of the United States Incorporated, there can be no complaints or accusations held against the American people nor any continuing claims against their assets based on the fraudulent misrepresentations of the United States of America, minor. 9. What remains to be resolved is an arbitration process by which the United States major is credited back costs which we have incurred by covering the United States Incorporated debts and which were never agreed to by any fiduciary deputies of ours. 10. We trust that the banks are well aware of where the accounts actually stand, the fraud that has been committed against the United States major, and their own fiduciary culpability. A prompt and just settlement of these issues is in the best interests of the entire planet, and we stand ready to do our part. We hope this synopsis of the situation clarifies it for everyone concerned. Please note the irrefutable evidence of the purposeful fraud that has been perpetuated against the American people contained in the protocol manual and attested to by every protocol officer, which states that the only purpose of the birth certificate is to naturalize citizens into the foreign jurisdiction of the United States defined as the Territories and District of Columbia. No such misrepresented and undisclosed process of naturalization may be considered valid. The United States of America, major, is alive and well despite the gross fraud and unnatural ingratitude of its employees. I am also enclosing a wet ink copy of the transmittal forwarded to Pope Francis and the Bank of International Settlements authorizing the transfer of credit from our trust accounts to cover all debts of the United States Inc. This was necessary to forestall violence based on false claims and presumptions against the American people and their assets. Mr. Kerry, you have a choice. You can voluntarily release all of the bogus franchises that have been created in the name of living Americans and save us all a lot of paperwork, or you can establish and publicize an agreed-upon process to return Americans to their lawful birthright status. This needs to be done without further obfuscation or obstruction. Sincerely, Judge Anna. 202. 3 days later, on May 13, 2016, an intelligence alert stated that all necessary components of American life and national mechanisms of function are securely within Republic control via the military forces of Commander-in-Chief General Joseph Dunford. 203. By May 20, 2016, the new U.S. Republic had issued sovereign letters, patented in November 2015, and appointed new federal representatives. Jacob Rothschild, representing the UN Corporation, and Pope Francis as trustee, were notified that the United States of America Incorporated had no contract, was acting on a for-hire basis only, and was obligated to honor the terms and conditions of the actual constitution while doing so. 204. As of Sunday evening, May 22, 2016, the Chinese elders placed their gold to back the entire new BRICS financial system. That included backing U.S. notes of the new U.S. Republic. 205. On Monday, May 23, 2016, the Chinese halted all financial extension graces to the ever-withering cabal political, financial, and military pageant. They eliminated the USA Inc. No sovereign country in active participation with the BRICS could participate with the USA Incorporated on their new gold-backed financial system. 206. There were 208 countries which had agreed to use the new BRICS electronic payment system that came online on May 23, 2016. The new BRICS CIPS electronic payment system of CIPS was active. The old Western banking system called SWIFT would not be able to access and exchange the new gold-backed yuan. 207. Also on May 23, 2016, U.S. financial markets were switched over to the new gold-backed money, as was every bank account in the U.S. system of finance. All Americans were now operating safely inside of the new BRICS system with no meaningful or immediate changes to day-to-day financial activities. 208. On May 24, 2016, the new monetary system had still not gone into effect. On that same day, Benjamin Fulford published, "The man who is blocking the new financial system and preventing the use of Asian gold for the benefit of the planet is Baron Jacob Nathaniel Rothschild, according to his close relatives as well as the CIA. Baron Rothschild is the head of the Hazarian Mafia, referred to as Octopus, that controls the issuance of US dollars, euros, Japanese yen, and many other currencies, not including the Chinese yuan, or the Russian ruble. If Baron Rothschild does not contact the White Dragon Society to negotiate a compromise within 24 hours of this newsletter being published, the White Dragon Society will offer 1 ton of gold, available for pickup in Hong Kong, to anybody who can persuade him to get out of the way." 209. Evidently the glitch in the system was corrected when on May 25, 2016, Fulford published, "The Rothschilds have contacted the White Dragon Society, so the 1 ton gold offer has been suspended. Negotiations are proceeding." 210. All 208 sovereign nations of the world were now expected to diplomatically, militarily, and financially recognize the Republic of the United States and their U.S. notes and Treasury Reserve notes as being gold and asset backed under the new BRICS system. 211. The USA Inc. and all of its agencies were no longer to be acknowledged on the global stage. 212. Under the new U.S. Republic, the U.S. Federal Reserve banking system was closed. The Fed was owned by a British foreign corporation and its monies had not been governed by the people, for the people. There were insufficient federal government controls over detailed physical performance and day-to-day operation of the Federal Reserve Bank for it to be considered a federal agency. 213. Under that U.S. Supreme Court ruling connected to NISRA, it was ruled that U.S. banks should be independent, privately owned and locally controlled corporations. The Fed would be replaced by a system of treasury banks which issued the new U.S. notes and treasury notes that were asset and gold-backed. 214. Under the new U.S. Republic the IRS and corrupt judges would be dealt with. 215. Under the new U.S. Republic the Bar Association and all U.S. attorneys would have to renounce their bar oath to the Temple Bar of London and become lawyers, but they couldn't be considered attorneys anymore. 216. Under the new U.S. Republic, the individual governments of the 50 states would remain in place. 217. The North American Union would be done and Washington, D.C. would be disincorporated. 218. Pope Francis had fired 5 of the cardinals out of the Vatican Bank, which controlled the world currency, before instigation of BRICS. 219. The new U.S. Republic military was in the process of reclaiming all military installations. 220. The purpose of the new U.S. Republic was to function as a restored constitutional government as established pre-Civil War. 221. By May 31, 2016, China and Japan had reached a gold agreement that settled all past disputes and debts. 222. On May 31, 2016, the Deutsche Bank, which held the highest amount of derivatives in the world, including many countries' debts, collapsed. That same day, the bank was revived with Royal Dragon family gold that secured the global currency reset. 223. On May 31, 2016, 19 different countries had their debts forgiven when the Deutsche Bank that held their derivatives collapsed, and were revived that same day when Royal Dragon family gold secured their currencies through participation in the global currency reset. 224. On May 31, 2016, the U.S. debt was forgiven when the Royal Dragon family gold that secured the global currency reset, backed the new U.S. Treasury note. 225. By June 2, 2016, a global debt relief had been achieved for all 209 sovereign nations in good standing with BRICS, including the U.S. This allowed the countries to be on a level playing field in international trade. 226. On June 2, 2016, at 8 p.m. Arabic Standard Time, Iraqi Prime Minister Abadi announced that all Iraqi cards were viable and charged. 227. On June 2, 2016, at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the new U.S. notes became internationally accepted currency. 228. By June 2, 2016, gold-backed historic bond redemptions were being paid out in any amount around the world. This meant the funds were well in place to handle the foreign currency exchange redemption process. In less than a minute, secure financial transactions could take place in the BRICS CIPS system. 229. On June 6, 2016, the first payments were set to begin for both historic assets payouts and foreign currency exchanges of the global currency reset. Initially there would be a revalue of 20 different currencies including the Iraqi dinar, Vietnamese dong, Zimbabwe zim, Indian rupee and Iranian rial. Revaluation of other world currencies was expected to quickly follow. 230. Higher exchange rates were to be made available during the first 6 days of initial exchanges, especially if a good percentage of monies were dedicated to humanitarian projects called prosperity packages. 231. These humanitarian projects were said funded in part by gold of the Chinese Royal Dragon families, and by $800 trillion in U.S. taxpayer monies, illegally taken by the Federal Reserve during the Bush administration, then confiscated during a 1992 Federal Reserve audit. 232. Another source of funds for the humanitarian projects, prosperity packages, was $3.8 trillion gained through a negotiated agreement with Soviet Secretary General Mikhail Gorbachev during the fall of the Soviet Union. The $3.8 trillion had also been illegally held by the Federal Reserve. 233. An additional $9.1 trillion for the prosperity packages would come from funds stolen from the American people by Supreme Court Justice John Roberts and President George Bush Sr. It was found through an intensive investigation that Chief Justice John Roberts and President Bush Sr. had stolen $9.1 trillion of USA taxpayers' funds from the U.S. Treasury, illegally held it at the Federal Reserve, and had been using the interest on it for their personal use. 234. See the trailer of a soon-to-be-released documentary about corruption in the Federal Reserve, Eagle 1 to Wanta. 235. There was a 3-hour feature documentary film produced about the U.S. monetary system and its relationship to the cabal, CIA, 9/11, which happened as an initial global currency reset was to take place, Presidents Johnson and Bush's and the assassination of President Kennedy. Right before Kennedy was murdered, he had signed documents which would have closed the Federal Reserve.
All the links from the original article can be found in the description box below.